Everybody, today we are in Unit 8, Day 5, and we are going to be talking about the war in Vietnam, which today is going to be a little bit of a longer day because the war in Vietnam really incorporates three different presidents, actually four, but we're going to focus on three different presidents today, as well as the results of the war and some other things going on in the country during that time, including what's going to end up being the downfall of a president and our first president to ever resign. So let's jump right in. So I wanted you to start with listening to this song. I'm sure you've all heard it, Fortunate Son. This is actually a lyric video showing you the lyrics of that. And I want you to pay attention to the lyrics of that song. The writer of the song, Creedence Clearwater Revival, the lead singer of it that actually wrote this song, he wrote this song while watching the wedding of David Eisenhower and Julie Nixon on TV. And think about the background of events that you also have going on during this time with the war in Vietnam and everything else going on. So I encourage you to check out and listen to that song. So why did the United States get involved in Vietnam? Well, of course, it reflected our policy of containment of communism. Again, you have North and South Vietnam there, and we'll get more into talking about that. North Vietnam attempted to force a communist government in South Vietnam, just like what we had seen over in Korea. And because of that, we would go in to help South Vietnam to resist their communist invaders. Again, put up the Southeast Asia map again for you here. You can see Vietnam there right south of China. If you notice there that on the map that Vietnam is all one country today, that should tell you a little bit about how the war goes here. So under JFK, we had mentioned this when we talked a little bit about him, that the troop buildup in Vietnam would start under him. JFK had adopted Eisenhower's domino theory. Again, the idea that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, then that would lead to a domino effect where other countries would as well. So under JFK, you're going to see that we continued our military aid to South Vietnam, and we increased the number of military advisors that we had in South Vietnam. Now, these soldiers were going here not to fight, but to provide training and supplies for the South Vietnamese armed forces. Also, they were helping fortify the villages there. But you can see by 1963, you'd have 16,000 U.S. troops there in support roles. The issue that we're going to have with Vietnam and why Vietnam is going to be a little bit different than Korea is that the leader of South Vietnam was not popular and was steadily losing support. And again, this is going to be a big difference between the war there. Whereas in the Korean War, you're going to see that South Korea really didn't want to fall to communism at all. South Vietnam is going to be a little bit different, though, when you're going to see, because of the corruption within the government that was happening within South Vietnam, that South Vietnamese people were really kind of open to a transition into communism. So 2 weeks before JFK's assassination, that South Vietnamese leader was overthrown and killed by South Vietnamese general. Now, these generals acted with the knowledge of the Kennedy administration. The CIA was aware of what was going to happen and that he was going to be overthrown, and they allowed that to happen. Now, Ho Chi Minh, who was in charge of North Vietnam and the communist movement there, he basically said that the United States was dumb for allowing this to happen, like that they should never allow this happen. So, again, looking back, 2020 vision, but we didn't have it then. So, now, LBJ would come president, obviously, with the assassination of JFK. And as he became president, things in Vietnam started to fall apart. Of course, you had the assassination of the South Vietnamese leader there. And by 1964, Vietnam is going to have 7 different governments, all claiming to be the rightful government of Vietnam. This is going to be one of the things that Goldwater is going to attack Johnson on for saying, look, Johnson, you're not doing enough in Vietnam to help against the fight in our fight against the Viet Cong. In August of 1964, and then again, this is going to be very controversial, Congress would vote to approve the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which basically allowed the president a blank check to protect U.S. interests in Vietnam. Now, the reason it's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is because allegedly North Vietnamese gunboats had fired on U.S. warships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Again, U.S. warships were over there helping to surveil and again helping out the South Vietnamese in their fight against North Vietnam. Now, allegedly, the North Vietnamese fired on one of these ships and had fired torpedoes at it. If you look this up, basically the advisors have admitted that that this was a falsehood, that this had never actually happened. Yes, the two sides had a conflict and actually had fired on each other, but really it had not been the fault of the North Vietnamese in this situation. So war would actually never be officially declared by Congress. So just like the Korean War, you would never have war officially declared. But this would basically give LBJ power to do whatever he wanted to with this Gulf of Tonkin or in Vietnam. You can see here two charts showing the buildup of the troops in Vietnam, and you can see that the buildup really it hit its max with Johnson being president. And you're going to see that's why there is so much anger towards LBJ because he is going to be the one that greatly increases the troop level there in Vietnam. So the war escalates. March of 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder is launched to use B-52 bombers against targets in North Vietnam, not North Korea, but in North Vietnam. In April, LBJ decides to use U.S. combat troops for the first time in the Viet Cong, or against the Viet Cong. Remember, we talked about how before the troops were just in a advisory role, but now they would actually be on the ground in combat. And you'll see by the end of 1965, you have 184,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. Now, Johnson's hope for this war was to win a war of attrition. So basically meaning that we felt like that we could wear down the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, that we could wear them down just because we had more supplies, more troops, and everything else than them. Winning a war of attrition is kind of like how the U.S. Civil War went. A lot of people in the North felt like eventually the South would just give up because they would run out of men and materials, which is kind of what happened. American generals, though, again, Vietnam War is very interesting because it was very much a jungle war, and all over Vietnam you have these small villages with basically peasants that lived in each one of these villages. And because we didn't really know the loyalty of each of those villages, the way that the generals went about this war is that we used search and destroy tactics. Basically, we would go village to village to village, trying to root out Viet Cong people in there. Again, this is not going to make the people of Vietnam, these Vietnamese peasants, very happy because they resented the U.S. troops coming into their village, trying to root out the Viet Cong within their villages. Another thing with Vietnam is that a lot of times these peasants just wanted to be left alone. So if the Viet Cong troops would come into their village, they would claim loyalty to them. If U.S. troops came in, they would claim loyalty to them. So that's another thing that's going to make the war in Vietnam very, very tough because really you don't know who the enemy is that you are fighting. Now, with Vietnam, you would see it would be fought as a limited war, meaning that the goal was for the Soviets and Chinese to stay out of the war. So we wanted to fight it in such a way that those two sides would not get in, because we had learned from North Korea or from the Korean War, the Chinese get involved. And again, that kind of escalates things even farther there. So as we talked about with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the misrepresentation that would happen there that would lead us into war, that's going to lead to something known as the credibility gap for LBJ. The public would become very skeptical of him because there was misinformation coming from the military and civilian leaders, combined with Johnson's reluctance to really speak frankly about what was happening in Vietnam. That caused what was known as the credibility gap. Again, people watched LBJ, they didn't believe what he was saying. Now, if you look at politics today, pretty much every politician that you see has a credibility gap because most people don't believe anything that politicians say, for the most part, unless it's somebody that aligns with your ideological view. So this is going to be huge for LBJ because people just aren't going to believe him. There's going to be this credibility gap. And you see that reflected in a lot of different ways. Now, when you look at the war in Vietnam, you're going to have two different sides, the Hawks versus the Doves. Supporters of the war, they were known as the Hawks. And they believed that the war was a Soviet-backed act of aggression and that we should do everything possible to defeat the North Vietnamese and drive out that Soviet influence. The people that were against the war, they were known as Doves, and they viewed the conflict as a civil war in Vietnam to overthrow a corrupt government, which the South Vietnamese government had been corrupt. Obviously, you saw the generals take out the leader there. And again, both of these sides, people would feel very, very strongly, and this would lead to a lot of active opposition of the war, especially on college campuses. College graduates would be eligible for the draft, and that's why you were going to see so much conflict on college campuses. Because if you think about it, and again, this is another pretty controversial thing about the war in Vietnam. If you were in college, you did not have to go fight in the war in Vietnam. So as people got closer to graduation in college, they start to get more and more worried because it's like, hey, I could be drafted after I get out of college. And that's, again, why you're going to see so much hostility to the war in Vietnam. Also, or on college campuses, that is. Also, you're going to have a lot of hostility from people that aren't in college as well, because they're going to look at this and say, how unfair is this that you go to college and because you're in college, you don't have to go to the war? So a lot of people looked at it as like basically a poor man's war, like that if you were poor and couldn't afford to go to college or you didn't want to go to college, then you got to go be in Vietnam. And that's why you're going to see so much hostility, especially within the Black community, to the war in Vietnam because of that. So the Tet Offensive. Tet Offensive is going to be something that is really going to change people's perspective on the war. January 1968, the Viet Cong, they would launch this all-out surprise attack on every provincial capital and every American base in South Vietnam. Now, U.S. forces, we would counterattack and inflict very heavy losses on the Viet Cong and regain any lost territory. So strategically and militarily, this would be a victory for the United States and the South Vietnamese, even though it was a surprise attack. But the key thing with this is that this offensive shocked Americans. Americans had viewed it as a huge setback in the war that they felt the U.S. was winning. Now, one of the things that you are going to see with the war in Vietnam is because this wasn't a traditional war where you could say like we were winning by the amount of territory that we had. One of the ways that it was the government would show that we were winning is just showing the death count, showing how many of the Viet Cong had been killed by the U.S. and South Vietnamese military there. So in that way, when it was presented to the American people, they would look at the death count and say, hey, clearly we are winning the war. Well, this Tet Offensive showed that maybe things weren't as rosy as the U.S. government was presenting it to the American people. And you're going to see that this is going to be reflected in how people view it. The political damage due to the Tet Offensive was going to be huge. And in fact, in February of 1968, Democratic primary was happening for the election that year. And in New Hampshire, the anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy took 42% of the vote against Johnson. So now it's very clear to Johnson, not only is the war going to be unpopular, but you're also going to see he's going to have a fight on his hands if he wants to get the Democratic nomination to run again for the presidency. So, the Tet Offensive, again, devastating to LBJ, but also it shows the American people, maybe the war in Vietnam isn't as it is being presented. Another thing that's really going to stir people is this image here at the top. I cannot say the guy's name, but basically you're going to have this Viet Cong captain this would be actually recorded as well. He is going to be captured during the Tet Offensive and actually brought to a South Vietnamese commander. That South Vietnamese commander is going to pull out his handgun there and shoot and kill this prisoner, shoot him right in the head, right there on TV and everything. And again, you're going to see with Vietnam that the images really do have a powerful role on the American people in their view of the war. And people viewed this and said, look, that's not how we operate. That's not how we work as a country. If you have a prisoner like this, then he needs to go through the whole POW process and all of that. He shouldn't just be executed in the middle of the street as happened there. So, and again, that was a South Vietnamese commander that did that, not a U.S. soldier that did that. So, all right, so you're going to start to see the end of the escalation of the war. The Joint Chief of Staff, after the Tet Offensive, they use this and say, hey, we need 200,000 more troops in Vietnam to hopefully put down this resistance that we are facing. Johnson, though, knew that the American people at this point were not going to put up with this. So March 31st, 1968, you would have Johnson who would go on and do a live TV address, and he would tell the American people that he would limit the bombing of North Vietnam and start to try to negotiate peace with them. Also, at the end of there, he threw in something that surprised and shocked everyone when he announced that he would not be running again for president. And again, there's going to be a lot of reasons why LBJ would do that. One of the reasons is he was going to be facing a lot of opposition. In fact, looking at the polling, it's probably likely that Robert Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, would actually have probably beat him in the primary to become the Democratic candidate for president. So, yeah, he drops out because he knows basically he's probably going to lose. Peace talks started in May of 1968. They quickly deadlocked, and that's why you're going to see that when Nixon comes in, of course, he's still going to inherit this mess to have to deal with. So now 1968, again, would be a year of a lot of crisis and change across the country. You would have the assassination of two key people. One, Martin Luther King Jr. would be assassinated in Memphis. He was assassinated by a guy who basically just hated the civil rights movement and hated Martin Luther King Jr. So again, that's going to be very devastating for civil rights leaders and civil rights advocates in the country. You would also have the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy would win the California Democratic primary for president. He would give his victory speech and then be killed in the back of. Actually, he was walking through a kitchen in the back to leave the place, and a Palestinian activist who was upset with Kennedy's support for Israel would shoot and kill him. So again, two pretty big assassinations. You would have the Civil Rights Act of 68 and the Fair Housing Act passed, which both prohibited discrimination in housing. One thing, though, you're going to see that with the death of Martin Luther King Jr., you are going to see a good amount of protests across the country and rioting due to that. Again, a lot of people very, very hurt and upset and shocked by that. Riots in over 168 cities, again, having to do with Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, but also people upset with the war in Vietnam, upset with the lack of progress in civil rights, upset over the draft, et cetera. So you're going to have a lot of rioting. So kind of like when we look at 2020 and what a mess 2020 has been in a lot of ways, that's kind of going to be what 1968 is. Also, you would have at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, you would have police riots as they were known. Basically, you had a group there that was protesting the Democratic Convention. They were upset about how the primary process had gone and their candidate did not win, and the police were called in after days and days of protesting to put down the protests that were happening there. So again, 68 is going to be quite a messy year here in the United States. Again, I talked about you, and again, I know this image is kind of shocking to you, but I talked about how African Americans in this country felt very upset about the war in Vietnam. And again, that fact to think about, that people, just because you were in college, you didn't have to go to war. And that upset a lot of people that were in poverty. It set up a lot of minorities who weren't necessarily going to college at this time. And that's why you're going to see this used a lot in protests by the Black Panthers and other groups. They say, look, why are we going to fight against Vietnam when we are facing so many issues here at home with civil rights and discrimination and that kind of thing? So it's just a very stirring image to kind of think about what was happening here at home and why African Americans might not want to go fight in the war in Vietnam as a result. So with this, you're going to see the creation, kind of stemming out of the protests of the war in Vietnam. You're going to see the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, and what is known as the New Left. This group would be formed, and really the focus at the beginning was on colleges, and it's basically said on college campuses, we want decisions to be made through participatory democracy. And those who supported Hayden's ideas, they became known as the New Left. And the SDS is going to be very, very active protesting on college campuses throughout the 1960s. And also kind of growing out of a faction of the SDS, you'd have the Weathermen Underground, who embraced violence and vandalism and carried out domestic terror attacks in the 1970s. And actually, Weathermen Underground is still classified as a terrorist group by the U.S. government. Again, just showing all the craziness going on in society during this time that you have the development of this group as well. You would also have the youth counterculture during this time. Young Americans began to revolt against authority and the middle class respectability. Remember that we talked about the 50s was a time of conformity. And really, you're going to see the 60s as a time where young people especially, are going to fight back against that conformity and not be happy with it. Some things that will kind of become common in certain groups in society are going to be communal living, rebellious styles of dress and music, drug use. And again, these became really popular amongst the groups known as the hippies or the flower children. And really, that culminates in the Woodstock Music Festival in August of 1969. There you see a lot of music. You also see a lot of drug use. But really, if you're looking at one event to kind of culminate and say this is what the youth counterculture looks like, look to the Woodstock Festival there. You will also see changes as far as how people view sex, and that's why this time will be known as the sexual revolution, because you start to have antibiotics come out for venereal diseases, also the introduction of the birth control pill. So again, views on sex and kind of fighting back against that traditional view on sex and marriage and that kind of thing. So again, youth counterculture are going to play a big part. I would argue that this counterculture still plays a big part today, because a lot of people that were involved in this are now in the leadership of our society, are on college campuses and that kind of thing. Also, another thing with Vietnam is that you are going to see that veterans were treated very, very poorly when they came home. Unlike what you saw with World War II and the Korean War, where veterans came home generally heroes, you're going to see a lot of people took out their anger on the war in Vietnam on the veterans that came home and blamed them for that. And I will say today, this is an area that our society has changed a lot, even though we might not agree with overseas wars that are happening. Generally, people respect the troops and know that they're not the one making the political decisions. They're just going there and doing their jobs. So it wouldn't be till years after that you're going to see that people start to show more respect for the Vietnam veterans. But again, just think about that people were really taking out a lot of anger that they had on the veterans coming home. So that leads us to the election of 1968. After Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Hubert Humphrey becomes the favorite and the eventual nominee of the Democrats. And again, this is going to be another reason people were so upset at the Democratic convention, because they didn't really like Humphrey. Former Alabama Governor George Wallace, he would run as a candidate for the American Independent Party. And you're going to see that he is really able to tap into white backlash over the anti-war protests, federal desegregation, race riots, two-party system. Again, there was a lot of anger that people had, and he's able to tap into that, especially in the South, because George Wallace had been the Alabama governor. And so, again, a lot of people already knew him in his fight against like desegregation and that kind of thing in the South. And then lastly, the Republicans would nominate former Vice President Nixon. He would win that. He promised peace with honor in Vietnam and a return to law and order in the U.S. And if you look down here at the bottom corner, you can even see his campaign button there. It says, close the credibility gap. So again, talking about that credibility gap. Now, when you look at George Wallace here, you think, why do people run as a third party? Do they really think they can win? Wallace's hope was that he would be able to win enough electoral college votes that neither Humphrey or Nixon would get the number that they needed, the 270, and that would throw the election over to the House of Representatives. That's what his hope was. So if you look here at the map, you're going to see what happened, and that Wallace actually was successful in taking some of the southern states there. And you can almost kind of see a split. Remember, we talked about, again, in the South, you saw a lot of the South voting Democratic, and you're going to see the South either turn over to the Republican or vote for Wallace and that. And this is, some people are going to call this a year of a political realignment, because you're going to see the end of the old New Deal coalition that had been around and the post-war, the liberal consensus, where you had even Republican candidates pushing more liberal type values, more New Deal style stuff. This election is going to kind of be the end of that, in kind of the start in the direction of this conservative revolution that we will talk about later. So do have two songs for you here, and we're going to do something with music a little bit later today. But there's two of them. There's going to be one that's a anti-war song, one that's a pro-war. I highly recommend listen to each of these and the message behind them, as they were both reflect very different views on the war in Vietnam. Hey, Hey, LBJ, that's one that my students have always liked in the past, just because it's kind of a catchy song with a very stirring message, we could say, in that. So what would Richard Nixon's foreign policy be? In his inaugural address, again, Nixon's going to promise to bring together Americans. The thing that you have to understand with Nixon is that Nixon was a very secretive guy and very suspicious. And after he gets elected, he starts to really isolate himself in the White House in what some people would call an imperial presidency. Again, kind of staying in the White House in his castle above it all. And this is going to cause massive problems for Nixon later on. This secretive, this desire to have control and that kind of thing, again, is going to cause big problems for him. Now, Nixon's first interest was in foreign policy. That was his background as vice president, and in his other roles in government. He had done a lot with foreign policy, so that was really his main interest during that time. So together with Henry Kissinger, who was his national security advisor and later would be his secretary of state, they fashioned a foreign policy to reduce some of the tensions of the Cold War. Now, one of the big things that Nixon is going to promise is peace with honor. And he would seek to reduce the U.S. involvement, as he had said, in the war while avoiding the appearance of defeat. So again, you don't want to be known as the president that pulled us out of Vietnam and leads to us losing that war. But again, you want to end the war. So he's trying to balance those two things. So Vietnamization, plan with this was to gradually reduce U.S. troops there and give the South Vietnamese money, weapons, and training needed to take over the war. So basically, South Vietnam would be taking over the war. Nixon would also proclaim what he called, or what would be known as the Nixon Doctrine, declaring that the U.S. would monetarily support future Asian allies rather than using U.S. troops. So basically, we're not going to send U.S. troops into Southeast Asia to deal in any of these countries, but we will financially support whatever side that we think should win, basically the side of freedom. Now, again, some issues with that, because remember, we had tried this before in Asia, and it usually didn't work out, and the money a lot of times would fall into the hands of the wrong people. So, yeah. Now, Cambodia. Again, bringing up another country here. In April of 1970, Nixon would expand the war by having U.S. forces invade Cambodia to try to destroy Vietnamese communist bases there. Now, again, Nixon had been talking about scaling back the war. People view this as an escalation, that we were increasing the war there, and this is going to lead, again, to more protests, especially on college campuses, which would really culminate at Kent State University in Ohio. You'd have the National Guard there, and due to some miscommunication and a whole host of errors there, they're going to fire on some of the students, leading to the death of 4 students there. Also, you'd have 2 students die in a protest at Jackson State University in Mississippi. So as a result of this, and again, a lot of people being angry, you're going to see the Senate would vote to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This would not get through the House, though, but it would show Congress is beginning to become willing to kind of limit some of the presidential powers of war. Because to this point, President kind of had a blank check because of that Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Also, during the same time, Americans would be shocked to learn about the 1968 My Lai massacre of women and children by U.S. troops in Vietnam. Again, this is something that had not come to light until 1970. Here is a picture from this massacre of March 1968. U.S. troops had gone into a village. Remember, I talked about the confusion in Vietnam because you didn't really know which side a village was actually supporting. U.S. troops would go in there and kill these women and children. Again, not that this should be justified, because it is horrible that this happened. And again, Americans would see images like this, and again, it would really question, like, why are we in Vietnam? What are we doing? This is not who we are as a country. This image here would later come out in 1972 of the napalm girl. You can see the girl there in the middle. I edited the picture a little bit there. She was running down the street naked after being burned by napalm there. And again, these kind of images, like I said, the war in Vietnam, the images are really going to be what is going to stir people the most to action and say, why are we in Vietnam? Like, what are we doing there? So transitioning a little bit to China, Nixon and Kissinger would come up with this policy known as détente, which is a deliberate reduction of Cold War tensions. This would lead in 1972, Nixon would visit China. He would be the first U.S. president to visit China. And as a result, eventually in 1979, the U.S. is going to finally recognize the Communist-controlled People's Republic of China. Ever since the 1940s, when the communists had come to power in China, we had not recognized them officially as the government there in China. So this did help to reduce some of the tensions between the U.S. and China, but also this would put pressure on the Soviets because the Soviets did not have the greatest relationship with China, even though they were both communist nations. So this is going to lead the Soviets to actually try to improve their relationship with us, because it was almost seen as in China, we had an ally over there. Even though we weren't really allies, it had the appearance of that. So that would actually lead to us signing the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty with the Soviet Union, again, to kind of reduce nuclear weapons and some of that tension there. Now, here domestically, you're going to see Nixon implements what he would call new federalism. He tries to slow the growth of Johnson's Great Society. One of the ways that he does this is by giving block grants to the states. So basically, instead of the federal government administering some of these programs, what he does is gives a block or a bunch of money to states and says, look, this is what this money is going towards. You need to use it on, healthcare or something like that, and then letting the states use that money as they saw fit. So again, this is a way of kind of transferring power back to the states. Also, another thing that Nixon is going to be involved in is what is known as the Southern Strategy. He tries to appeal, if you remember the election map, that Wallace had a lot of support in the Deep South that Nixon did not. So Nixon implements what would be known as his Southern Strategy, where he tries to appeal to conservative voters that he called the silent majority that were disillusioned due to the 60. And again, if you hear some of these terms here, they're going to be very familiar if you've watched the news about the silent majority, law and order. Again, things are cyclical. They come back. These were voters, though, that he was trying to appeal to included Democrats, Southern whites, Northern Catholic blue-collar workers, and suburbanites. And another way that he is going to try to win back the South is by asking federal courts to delay some of the integration plans and nominating 2 conservative justices for the Supreme Court. They would both be rejected, but again, that got him in a better light, looking in a better light to people within the South. Now, probably the most lasting legacy, and I've probably said this before, of any president is going to be their Supreme Court justices. And Nixon would appoint Warren G. Burger to replace Earl Warren as Chief Justice. We talked about Earl Warren before, how his court was more liberal and how his court did a lot, especially in the arena of civil rights and that kind of thing. So the Burger court would be more conservative, but the Burger court would do things that angered conservative voters. So in 1971, they would rule in favor of school busing, which we'll talk about more when we get to civil rights. 1972, it would create guidelines to make giving the death penalty more difficult. And then 1973, probably the most controversial, probably you've heard of this case before, the Burger court would decide the Roe versus Wade decision, which struck down many state laws on abortion and said that limits on abortion were a violation of a woman's right to privacy. So again, these things would really anger a lot of conservatives that Nixon had been trying to appeal to. Also, more famously, the Burger court would rule against Nixon when we get to talking about his impeachment or his Watergate scandal. They would rule against him and some of his executive powers during that as well. So it just goes to show you, again, as president, your lasting legacy is the court, and you can pick people who you think in the court are going to side with you and are either conservative or liberal, whatever side that you are on, but that might not be the way that things go for you. So the end of the war in Vietnam. Kissinger would hold secret meetings with North Vietnamese leaders, and he would announce in 1972 that peace was at hand. Peace would be here soon. You're going to see that when the two sides couldn't really reach a very good deal, that Nixon said, let's put pressure on North Vietnam. So Nixon would order the heaviest air attacks of the war on North Vietnam during this time. And after several weeks of very heavy bombing, the North Vietnamese would agree to an armistice. And this armistice, again, that's not a peace treaty. It's an armistice. It would allow the U.S. to pull our troops out of Vietnam. Now, the end result of Vietnam, you see 58 plus thousand Americans dead, 303,000 wounded, and $118 billion spent on the war. And a lot of Americans are going to look at this really in the end and say, what was it for? We didn't achieve our goal. And really, why did we do this? What was the purpose of the war in Vietnam? So a lot of Americans are going to be kind of bitter about that. Now, 1972, Nixon runs for re-election. His Southern strategy works. And you can see he does extremely well in this election, only losing D.C. and Massachusetts there, and really trouncing George McGovern pretty easily during this time. Now, think about Nixon. He wins by so much here, which means he has the support of the American people. He's won re-election. He doesn't need to worry about the next election. But Nixon, being kind of the control freak he was, he would be worried about that. So June 1972, again, this would be before the election, you're going to see the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in D.C. would be broken into men who would later find out they would be hired by Nixon's re-election committee. Now, previously, Nixon and people associated with him had done the following. They had ordered wiretaps on government employees and reporters to help stop news leaks. They had created a group called the Plumbers to stop leaks and to discredit their opponents. And they had created an enemies list of prominent Americans that opposed Nixon and the war in Vietnam, and the IRS would actually target people from that list. So there had been shady things happening within the Nixon administration for a while, just nobody ever really heard much about these things happening. So there would be no solid proof really showing that Nixon had ordered any of the illegal activities. And it would become apparent through this that while he might not have known or had direct knowledge of what was going to happen at Watergate, he did engage in an illegal cover-up to try to hide that it was happening. You're going to see the Senate starts investigating this and would bring many of Nixon's abuses to the attention of Americans. And probably the most damaging testimony against Nixon would be the White House lawyer, John Dean. He would testify and link the president to the cover-up that was happening there. Also, you could have a couple investigative reporters within D.C. I forget what paper they worked for off the top of my head, but one of them was Bob Woodward, and they would get information from somebody who was codenamed Deep Throat, who would share a lot of information with them that they would put in the newspaper about what was happening within Nixon's administration. Also, during the Senate hearings, it would be discovered that the Oval Office had a taping system, and that taping system was taping everything that happened within the Oval Office. That leads Nixon, of course, the Senate says, we want those tapes turned over so we can hear what's happening within the Oval Office. Nixon says, no, I have executive privilege. I do not have to turn over those tapes to you. Now, just to add, again, more insult to injury here for Nixon, in fall of 1973, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, would actually resign when it comes out that he had accepted bribes as governor of Maryland. So he resigns, and Nixon would name Michigan Senator Gerald Ford to take over that position there. So other events in 1973 that would happen. November 1973, Congress would pass the War Powers Act over Nixon's veto in order to limit the president's war powers. This War Powers Act is still in effect today, and this law requires the president to report to Congress within 48 hours of taking any military action, and if that action lasts over 60 days, there must be congressional approval. So basically, instead of giving the president just this blank check to do whatever he wants, it's trying to put more power of Congress over the president. Again, Nixon not happy with this, but Congress would overrule his veto. On October 6th of 1973, you had Syria and Egypt would launch a surprise attack on Israel. Nixon would airlift almost $2 billion in arms to Israel, which helped them to defeat Syria and Egypt. This is known as the Six-Day War. Really, the big implication that this is going to have on the United States is that OPEC, in response, would place an embargo on oil sold to any country that supported Israel, including the United States. This would lead to a massive spike in oil prices. This would be the first of 2 times in the 70s you're going to have an oil crisis. As a result of this, you're going to see Americans start buying more Japanese-made cars. To this point, big American cars with V8 engines were very, very popular. And now, because of gas prices skyrocketing, you're going to see people turn to smaller, more fuel efficient cars. And Congress would approve a nationwide 55 mile an hour speed limit to hopefully help save gas and help people save gas. Still, though, the economy is going to struggle as a result. So, August 9th, 1974, before this date, Nixon had fired the special prosecutor assigned to the Watergate case, leading the attorney general to resign in protest. The Supreme Court would rule against Nixon and force him to turn over the Oval Office tapes. Nixon would do so, but you're going to see on one tape that there is going to be 18 and a half minutes of recordings just blank. They were gone. The Nixon administration blamed this on a secretary who had apparently put her foot on the microphone. But I think it's very clear to most people that 18 and a half minutes definitely contained information that Nixon did not want to go out. You're going to see that within the House of Representatives, they were preparing to possibly vote, or they were definitely going to vote on bringing charges against the president, which would then lead to impeachment. And probably Nixon would have been our first president to ever be removed from office. Faced with this impeachment, Nixon decides that it is in his best interest and the best interest of the nation to resign. He would go on TV and announce his resignation. I saw this letter, actually. If you go to the National Archives, they have it displayed there. His letter to Henry Kissinger announcing that he resigns. And it's pretty amazing to think about what a big job the presidency is in this resignation. Dear Mr. Secretary, I hereby resign the office of President of the United States. Incredible. Vice President Gerald Ford would be sworn in as president. And interesting thing about Gerald Ford is he would serve as both president and vice president without ever being elected for either one of those positions. Again, remember, he had moved in because of the resignation of the vice president. And then, of course, the president resigns and he would move into that position. Again, you see here the video clip of Nixon announcing his resignation, and he'll share a couple of his reasons why he is going to resign. So lastly here, what is the impact of Watergate? You're going to see that this scandal only increased and continued the growing lack of faith that Americans had in the federal government. Reporter and author Bob Woodward, again, one of those ones I had mentioned, him and Carl Bernstein had both helped really crack open a lot of information on the Watergate scandal. I heard him say this quote in an interview one time, and it really is true. He says, Watergate dropped a cynical bomb on the American people from which they have not recovered. And man, is that true. Really, you're going to see that today, you're going to be lucky to find somebody that says they actually trust the government. Most people are going to say they have zero trust in the U.S. government. And a lot of this goes back, again, we talked about the JFK assassination and the Warren Commission and how people didn't really trust that. And then you have Watergate happens where people that leads people further into that cynicism towards the government. Others also would point to the scandal as the danger of the growing power of the presidency. Remember, the presidency had kind of been on hyperdrive growing in power since FDR and the Great Depression and World War II. So really, at the end of this era, you've had Vietnam, you've had Watergate, and you've had all kinds of things that really culminate in really people distrusting the U.S. government in a big way. And I would argue we still see that within society today, that people really have zero trust for the government and what the government tells us. Look today, we're in 2020. The government's talking about creating this vaccine for the coronavirus. And how many people say they don't trust the government to effectively make this vaccine, and they don't trust the government rollout of it. So really, you can see the legacy of all these things happening to today. So sorry, I know this was a longer video for you, a lot of information in it, but a very critical time here in American history. So I hope you enjoy listening to the music that you're going to listen to today, and hope you have a great day.